I married Carol in 1993 and we lived here. This was our first house together, and she just accepted me as I am, and that's all I needed. My self-confidence improved no end, and she transformed my life, really. In my mid-20s, I was referred by my GP to Prescott House to see a clinical psychologist, and she gave me a set of social skills, taught me things really that most other people learn as they're growing up through life. But thanks to that set of skills, I became better equipped at dealing with people. This is Buell Hill Avenue in Little Hulton. I lived here for about 4 years, until 2004. In an upstairs one-bedroom flat, lived there with Carol, and that's where I wrote this, the novel of Android and Sentry Lodge. In 2003 I read an edition of Doctor Who magazine, of all things, and there was an article in there entitled The Fan Gene, and the journalist Gary Gillett was at a Doctor Who convention, he says, and was at the bar talking to one of the actors from the series, and he just asked the actor, what do you think makes fans gather together at conventions like this? And the actor said, well, I think you're all a little bit autistic. And this threw Gary at the time, but he looked up autism, and under the umbrella of the autistic spectrum, he found Asperger's syndrome. And that has a spectrum all its own. At one end you've got those who are quite severely autistic. They, when they're stressed, might rock back and forth. They may talk in a monotone voice about their favourite subjects, and maybe even walk with an unusual gait. But at the other end of the spectrum there are people like me with obsessive thinking, social phobia. And that got me thinking about Asperger's syndrome. A month or so later, I was reading an interview with Gary Newman on the internet, and it turns out that Gary's wife, her brother, has been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and she thinks now that Gary himself probably is on the spectrum. So that fascinated me even more so. Then, after that, I saw a documentary on BBC Two entitled My Family and Autism, looking at the Jackson family, Jackie Jackson and her boys who are all on the autistic spectrum. Luke, the 14-year-old boy who presented the programme, had Asperger's syndrome, and everything he had to say rang bells with me. And then I bought his book, Freaks, Geeks and Asperger's Syndrome. I found that fascinating. I then read a book by Dr. Tony Attwood, the world expert on the condition, and then I went to the publisher's website, Jessica Kingsley Publishers, and saw that they accepted submissions, so I submitted my own autobiography, and in the autumn of 2004 they published it, The Feelings Unmutual, along with a new version of Android and Sentry Lodge. And recently, Dr. Tony Attwood published a new book, The Complete Guide to Asperger's Syndrome, and The Feelings Unmutual is quoted 3 times in this, and Android is mentioned too. The publisher, Jessica Kingsley, asked if I could approach some of the people I mentioned in the book to see if they would endorse it. And a few months later, she sent the endorsements through, 2 endorsements, and I can remember them arriving. I was sat at the kitchen table and just staring at them, and my wife Carol looked over and she said, "Are you alright, love?" And I said, "The endorsements have come through." And she said, "You look like you're going to burst into tears." And to be honest, I felt like I was, because I never thought for a minute that someone like Colin Baker or John Christopher would endorse anything that I'd done. Here's what Colin Baker said: "With disarming honesty, Will Hadcroft takes us on an often painful journey through a life made tolerable by intermittent escape from the confusing world around him into the alternative worlds offered by fantasy and science fiction on television. I feel humbled and proud to have been there for Will with my TARDIS, albeit on a television screen, when he needed an anchor. Any actor who needs to justify his trade should read this book, as should anyone who simply wants to experience a fine writer telling his own moving and honest story." I met Colin Baker in 1985 when I was 15 outside the Doctor Who exhibition in Blackpool, and was so shy I couldn't speak to him, so in awe of him. So in 2004, when the book came out, it was great for him to endorse it, but also great that I finally got to meet him a few months later after a play. I met him a couple of more times since, and it's really brought some closure to my obsession with Doctor Who. John Christopher wrote the Tripods trilogy, an award-winning series of books, my personal favourites of everything he wrote. I absolutely adore that story. He wrote the Swords of the Spirits trilogy, or the Prince in Waiting trilogy. That's his own personal favourite. In the 1950s, he wrote a highly acclaimed novel called The Death of Grass, an apocalyptic future novel that is very highly regarded even today. His real name is Sam Meowd, and he had this to say: "Will Hadcroft's fascinating and compulsively readable book offers a powerful insight into fears and horrors more chilling than anything portrayed in fiction, and into his courage in coping with them." I think the book was published in September 2004. Well, by November of the same year, Carol, my wife, and I met Sam Meowd in his own home, where we sat in his living room drinking tea and talking tripods. It was a real dream come true for me. I'm really pleased that the book has been so well received. This is a review by Beth Billington, who is a clinical psychologist working with adults who have learning difficulties. And she says this book sat on a shelf for weeks before being opened. The title seemed aggressive, and I wasn't keen to get started. When I did start reading, I was instantly hooked on Will Hadcroft's engaging style and vivid descriptions. It is the autobiography of a man who grew up in 1980s England on a diet of TV science fiction series such as Doctor Who and the Tripods. A rather limited diet, it seemed, to those around him, who despaired at Will's inability to fit in. To Will, however, sci-fi provided escape and safety in a nonsensical world. Like the characters, he grew up feeling alien, different, and out of place, but never knowing why. Each time young Will tried to be normal and engage the world, it went horribly wrong, and he writes that he felt as though he was the subject of some sick joke, and that the whole world was in on it. Only as an adult did Hadcroft find his answer, realizing that there were other people who experienced life in the same way as he did. He had always known that social skills came easily to others, and this was something he simply could not fathom. And now he knows why. From childhood confusion, through low mood and despair, to becoming an accomplished author, The Feelings Unmutual is a glorious read, a book that is hard to put down. I now live in Bolton. I've worked in an office since 2004, really get on with the people well. I'm now concentrating on my writing. The second Android and the House of Shadows, came out in 2008. The third one, Android and the Ghosts of Winter Hill, comes out in 2011, as does my standalone novel for teenagers, The Blueprint. At one time I would have really balked at the idea of having a label like Asperger's syndrome, but now I embrace it because it's given me answers to questions that have perplexed me for decades. And now I can kiss that past goodbye and embrace the future.